The wind screamed that night like it was trying to tear the roof off the world, and still no one thought to ask how the widow's chimney hadn't belched a single wisp of smoke in weeks. Not a one among them thought to wonder why her windows never frosted over. They just called her slow, odd and quiet. Said she didn't have the gumption to make it to spring, not with 3 children and no husband, not with that tiny cabin tucked into the edge of the valley where the sun barely touched past November. But what they didn't know was that while their fires died to ash, and their logs froze wet before they could split them, the widow's cabin stayed warm enough to cook bread without a flame, and no one would have believed how she did it, not until it was almost too late. It started the day the second storm rolled through and stayed. Folks were still sore from the last one, the one that buried Mr. Starn's mule alive and turned Clara Reeves' well into a pillar of ice overnight. This one hit harder. First came the wind, then the ice, then the sky dropped snow like it was punishing the ground. Sores froze in hands, food spoiled in cellars buried too deep, and smoke rose like dying sighs from every roof in the valley except one, the widow's. Her name was Naomi Harrow, and though most called her the simple Harrow woman behind her back, there wasn't much simple about a mother who'd survived 2 winters alone after her husband's fever took him, and a third of the valley besides. She didn't cry at the funeral. She just bundled her youngest tighter, nodded to the preacher, and walked home with her chin to the wind. Folks took it for dullness. They never thought it might be resolved. By the 3rd day of storm, settlers began doing what they always did, grumbling loud and suffering quiet. Some split furniture for fuel. Some packed snow into blankets just to keep the wind from crawling under the walls. Some left meat out to freeze on purpose so they could scrape the ice off for soup later. No one had time to spare for rumors about the Harrow place, except for old Vernon Black, who had taken to watching her home from the ridge with his brass spyglass and a flask of whiskey tucked into his coat. "She's not burning a thing," he swore to the others in the tavern before dusk on the 4th day. "Not a twig, no smoke, no frost on the windows either. Maybe she's dead," someone muttered, and a few chuckled, but Vernon didn't laugh. "No, I saw her step outside, checked her well, took a shovel to the wall, like she was digging at the base. Maybe she's finally lost it," said John Booth, pulling his coat tighter. "Was only a matter of time, her or the kids." But Vernon just shook his head. "She ain't cold, I'm telling you. Her place is warm." No one believed him, not really, but they couldn't ignore what he'd said either, especially not when half the valley was losing toes to frostbite and boiling. Snow for soup. Curiosity crept in like smoke under a door. Quiet, thin, but there. The real story began the next morning when Clara Reeve, hands blistered from melting ice off her well pump, packed some bread into her coat and trudged through waist-high snow to the Harrow cabin. She meant to bring pity, she meant to offer help, but what she found made her stop cold, mouth open. The windows glowed, not just light, but warmth, yellow warmth, soft and steady. No flicker, no shadows like fire, just warmth. And when Naomi opened the door, holding her youngest on one hip, the heat rolled out like a breath from summer. Clara stared past her shoulder, dumbfounded. No fire, no stove lit, just thick rugs on the floor, walls layered with strange patchwork cloth and sealed seams. And in the middle of the room, a hollow in the earth, rimmed with stone, faint steam rising. Not smoke, steam. "What in heaven's name?" Clara whispered. Naomi didn't answer, not at first. She just invited her in, handed her a cup of something warm and thick-smelling, bone broth maybe, or beanstalk. Clara took it with shaking hands. "You don't use fire?" she finally asked. "Not since October," Naomi said simply. Clara blinked. "But you're warm. Your children aren't bundled. You've got no firewood stacked." Naomi nodded, and for the first time, Clara saw something behind her eyes. Not dullness, not weariness, calculation, thought, memory. "We dug low," Naomi said, gesturing to the hollow. "Below frost. Sealed it all. Let the earth heat hold. Kept the warm in. Kept the wind out. Covered the seams. Used rocks. Stored heat." Clara didn't understand it all, but she didn't need to. The warmth spoke for itself. That night, word spread like coals under ash. Quiet, slow, but hot. Naomi Harrow's place was warm, without fire. She'd done something to the ground, they said. Used some trick with rocks and blankets. Some said it was devilry. Others whispered it was a trick passed down from her mother's people, though no one could remember where Naomi came from exactly. Just that she didn't speak much. And her husband had been a trapper who died too young. By week's end, 5 more settlers had braved the snow to see the miracle. Naomi said little, but she didn't turn them away. She let them sit on the rug, sip broth, and feel the air warm their fingers again. Some cried, others asked for tools. A few just sat in stunned silence, and still not one fully understood what she'd done. How a simple widow had managed to solve the winter in a valley where every man with an axe and fire pit had failed. But the cold wasn't done, not yet, and neither was Naomi, because 2 valleys over, A sickness had broken loose. It traveled with the mail wagon, frostbitten hands on leather reins, a cough that wouldn't stop, the kind of sickness that spreads fast when cold keeps people too close, too tight, and too desperate to rest. It would reach them in days, and Naomi knew it. She'd seen it once before, and that was why she'd started digging in the first place. The cold didn't let up, and neither did the whispers. By the seventh day of storm, Naomi Harrow's cabin had become a name passed between chapped lips and blue fingers like some impossible fable. But the ones who'd been inside knew better. It wasn't magic, it wasn't chance, it was deliberate, it was quiet, and it was real. Vernon Black went next, not because he believed in miracles, but because his daughter wouldn't stop coughing, and his boy hadn't eaten in 2 days. He came dragging behind a mule that looked half dead, his coat dusted with snow, face cracked and pale. Naomi met him without a word and helped him inside. No questions, no judgment. He stayed 2 nights, curled in a corner on the thick wrapped floor, the heat from the earth sinking up through his bones like a salve. He left silent, but when he returned to his own place, he began hauling rocks. Not wood, not coal, just rocks. He stacked them in a ring near his cabin's center, cleared out the hearth, and started digging. "You've lost your mind," his neighbor called through the snow. "Storm's not done yet, and you're carving out the floor?" But Vernon didn't answer. He only looked at his girl, wrapped in quilts too thin, and kept digging. The strange thing was, he wasn't alone. By the 9th day, a half-dozen others had made their way to Naomi's place. Some came out of curiosity, some came in quiet desperation, some didn't speak at all. They sat in the warmth, felt the hush of still air where no wind pierced, and left changed. Each one tried to copy what they saw. They failed in pieces. One used damp stones that cracked, another dug too shallow, one sealed nothing and lost all the heat within hours. But bit by bit the rumor took root deeper than frost. Naomi hadn't just survived. She had outthought the freeze, and that wasn't supposed to be possible. Not for a woman, not for a widow, not without a man, or a fire, or a cord of wood taller than her roof. It wasn't that the valley distrusted women, at least that's what they'd have told you. It was that they trusted tradition. Men built, women kept. That was the rhythm, that was the way. But Naomi hadn't kept anything. She'd built something different, something forgotten, something lost. And that, in its quiet way, made people afraid, especially the ones who'd mocked her most, like John Booth. John Booth was the kind of man who refused help on principle. He split logs by hand, even when his shoulder went bad. He'd been the first to say Naomi would starve by Christmas, the first to laugh when she refused the charity wagon. And now, he was the one with smoke-stained eyes and a wife coughing blood into handkerchiefs frozen stiff by morning. He hadn't gone to Naomi's cabin, not yet, but he started watching. He built a lean-to near her ridge and sat in it with a blanket and spyglass for 3 nights straight, watching who came and went, what they carried, how long they stayed. It didn't make sense to him. There were no wagons hauling coal, no men cutting logs for her, no extra blankets strung across her rafters. Just that cabin, low, still, sealed tight, and the soft amber light in the window, never flickering. By the time the 11th night came, Booth's boy had gone near silent, pale, eyes glassy. His wife stopped speaking, just stared at the wall. And still, John sat in his lean-to, watching, fists clenched so tight the skin split. It was Vernon Black who finally marched up to him through the snow, breath steaming, coat open like he didn't feel the cold anymore. "You waiting for pride to thaw the ground?" he said. "Get up." John said nothing. Vernon tossed a wrapped stone at his feet. "Warmed it 3 hours on a bed of ashless coals, buried under sand, holds the heat." "She showed me." John looked down at the stone. It didn't smoke, didn't glow, just sat there. But he picked it up and almost dropped it from the shock. Warm, heavy and warm, like it had been pulled from summer itself. "She's not just using the ground," Vernon said. "She's trapping heat beneath it, under clay, sand, using rocks like wells for warmth, layers, seals the air, keeps it moving low, not up, not out." John finally stood. "You saying she built a stove out of dirt?" "I'm saying," Vernon said, "she built something we were too damn proud to consider." They stood there in silence. Then John went inside his house, picked up his son, and carried him into the storm. Naomi opened her door before he knocked. She didn't smile, she didn't nod, she just stepped aside. And that was the last time John Booth mocked a woman for knowing something he didn't. As more people came, the rumors changed. They weren't whispers anymore. They were quiet oaths, half in awe, half in shame. Because it wasn't just survival Naomi had managed, it was stability. The storm had taken the outer barns of 6 farms. It had frozen 2 babies in their sleep on the far ridge. It had collapsed the Reeves' cellar roof and scattered their pickled stores into a frozen swamp. But Naomi's cabin stood untouched. The snow layered smooth over her roof but never crusted at the door. The frost didn't reach her panes. Inside, she grew sprigs of green in clay pots near the warm pit, and all this without lighting a single log since October. It wasn't witchcraft. It was observation. She'd watched how the wind moved, how snow insulated when kept packed, how earth 3 feet down stayed steady even in the worst cold, how rocks held heat if stacked tight and sealed beneath clay. Her husband had taught her some of it. The rest she'd learned alone. She hadn't spoken of it because she didn't think it strange. It was just what needed doing. But now, as families staggered into her doorway, pale and broken, she began to teach, not with words, with gestures, with warmth. She showed how to pack the ground right, how to shape the vent low and wide, how to stack layers, stone, sand, clay, then cloth. She showed how to build low beds along the edges to capture heat, how to hang blankets to redirect warm air downward, how to boil water beneath sealed pots to fill the space with safe, humid warmth. She even took her youngest outside to help others dig. The child dragged rugs behind her like banners, laying them over floors packed by frozen hands. And Naomi never stopped moving, even when her own fingers bled, even when her knees cracked from the cold, because she knew what was coming next. The fever. It started with the Evans boy. He'd come in coughing, eyes red, and by morning he couldn't speak. By dusk, he was delirious. Others followed. The warmth brought them safety, but also contact. Naomi's cabin became too full, so she built another, then another. Low, dug into snowbanks, sealed tight, fitted with the same simple stone pits and insulated floors. They weren't shelters, they were cures, not from sickness itself, but from the cold that made sickness fatal. For every man who dismissed her, 10 others followed her lead. They dropped axes and took up shovels. They dug deep, packed clay, watched frost lines, listened to the way silence changed between snowbanks. And in time, the valley became something it had never been. Quiet, still, alive. But not everyone was pleased. 2 men from the Timber Guild came one morning with questions, then accusations. Said Naomi was spreading false hope, that her methods were dangerous, that burying heat sources in homes was folly. She didn't answer. She took them inside, let them sit. When they left, they took nothing with them, but they came back a week later with shovels. The last man to speak against her did so in the tavern. She's got them worshipping a dirt stove, he said, and when spring comes, they'll forget. Go back to cutting wood and wasting time. No one replied. But when he left, he walked out alone, past the ridge, into the dark, and did not return. By the 15th day, the snow began to slacken, not melt, not retreat, but rest, and for the first time, smoke rose from Naomi's cabin, just a thin wisp, not from need, but from bread. She baked a loaf for the valley. They broke it by hand, seated around that hollow ring of earth-warmed stone. Children curled on the floor beside elders wrapped in wool and patchwork. No one asked questions, no one made speeches. They just ate, grateful, changed, because they all knew, whether they said it or not, that the valley hadn't just survived the winter. It had been rebuilt, and not by might, not by strength, but by the quiet, deliberate work of a woman everyone once thought too simple to matter. By the time the wind quieted, something strange had settled over the valley, quieter than the storm, heavier than the snow. It was respect, uneasy, unspoken, and awkward, like something none of them had learned the words for. You could see it in the way men shifted their hats when Naomi walked by, in the way wives elbowed their husbands into silence if they so much as muttered her name without reverence. No one called her the simple widow anymore, not out loud, not even in the dark. Naomi didn't change. She still tied her hair the same way, still wore her husband's old coat stitched with twine at the elbows, still walked with her middle child strapped to her back, and the other 2 holding each hand. But now, when she passed through the center of town, which was really just the wide dirt path between the smithy and the church, people parted like she carried fire underfoot. But Naomi wasn't interested in their awe. She wasn't done. The cold hadn't broken, not fully. It just stopped biting quite so hard. The snow still stood up to a man's thigh, and even the dogs had gone quiet. But Naomi had seen this weather before, and it was the kind that played tricks, offering a lull, making folks think they'd made it, luring them into foolishness. That's when people stopped boiling water, stopped sealing seams, stopped stacking stones, and let the wet creep back in. That was the real killer, not the first storm, but the second that followed once people were worn out. Naomi moved faster now. Her eyes were harder, voice sharper. The little community she'd built around her cabin had turned into a cluster of half-dug warmth cells and pit shelters, and she was at the center of it like a foreman. She checked each one, stepped into dugouts, pressed her bare palm against clay walls, sniffed the air near exhaust vents to make sure it pulled right. She didn't waste time explaining anymore. She just pointed. This wall's too thin. Add another layer of sand and trap air behind it. The heat's leaking into the snowpack and refreezing above. That pipe's too narrow. The warm air will choke and push smoke back into your face. Line that pit with drier stones. You're heating waterlogged rock. It won't hold. The people listened now. Men who hadn't taken orders since the war nodded when she spoke. Women followed her through the snowbank trails with their children in tow, copying how she packed her boots with wool and how she used hay between her gloves and sleeves. Even Preacher Enoch, who'd lost his roof 2 weeks before and nearly died under the collapse, now spent his afternoons hauling buckets of dry sand to whoever Naomi told him to. But there was still danger. The sickness hadn't burned out. It had just gone quiet. It was hiding in the ones who hadn't come to Naomi's cabins, the ones still holding out in the higher reaches of the valley, the ones too proud or too far to come down. One of them was Nora Bell. Nora lived up in the timberline, alone since her husband had been crushed beneath a saw log last spring. She hadn't come down once. She hadn't sent word, but Naomi knew she was up there. She also knew what the silence meant, so she went. She didn't tell the others, just packed a pot of hot stones into a thick wrapped sack, tied it to her back, and set off after sundown when the air was coldest. Her boots sank nearly to the knee, and her breath turned brittle with each step. But she didn't stop, didn't turn back, even when the trail vanished under wind-swept drifts and the stars blinked out behind the storm veil, gathering again overhead. It took her the better part of the night to reach the Bell place. By the time she got there, she had to dig the door clear just to knock. No answer. She knocked again, still nothing. So she braced her shoulder against the door and shoved. It creaked, groaned, then gave way, half frozen open like a corpse, unclenching its jaw. Inside was dark. No fire, no smell of smoke, just the sour scent of sweat and rot and something else, something thin and sickly. Naomi stepped in. The frost had climbed the walls in branching patterns like bone fingers. The stove was cold, the windows were rimmed white, and in the corner, barely visible under a sagging quilt, was Nora Bell. She was alive, but only just. Eyes cracked open as Naomi approached, lips dry as split bark. "You came," Nora croaked. Naomi didn't answer, just untied the stone bundle, pulled the hot rock from its wrapping, and slid it under the quilt near Nora's feet. "Why?" Nora whispered. "You're not dead," Naomi said. "Yet." That was the only answer she gave. Naomi stayed with her through the night, fed her spoonfuls of hot broth from a flask she kept in her coat, rubbed warmth into her hands and feet, repacked the rock every few hours with wool, and wrapped it in canvas to preserve the heat. By dawn, Nora could sit up. By midday, she could speak without coughing blood. By evening, she cried. "I thought I had to die here," she said. "Didn't want to beg." Naomi stirred another pot of thin soup over the stone pit she'd dug in the middle of the Bell cabin floor. "You don't beg," Naomi said. "You build." She brought Nora back down 3 days later, half carried on a sled made from the Bell's broken barn door. The people watched from the edge of the trail as Naomi pulled her through the snow, like it weighed nothing. No one said a word. They just opened the path. That act changed everything. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was rescue. Naomi hadn't just found a way to keep warm. She'd found a way to keep people from dying who would have been written off. So they began to listen differently. A few of the younger men, Elias Gray, Tom Darnell, even Quiet Jed from the tannery, began following her full-time. They took notes. They learned to mix the clay in proper ratios with snow, to use ash and sand as insulation layers. They sketched the shelter layouts Naomi designed, learned to gauge where to dig based on wind drift patterns, and even started measuring interior humidity with makeshift cloth testers. And Naomi taught them, not with kindness but with clarity. "This is what's left when the rest burns out," she said once, while showing them how to line a pit with broken pottery to reflect heat. "It's not clever. It's necessary." She didn't ask for thanks. She didn't give comfort. She gave instruction, and they followed it. But all of this came at a cost, because even as the valley bent to Naomi's example, the outside world was still spinning, slower now, but not gone. Word had traveled, and with word came visitors. The first was a man named Lennox from the southern county. He arrived with 2 horses, a journal in his coat, and 3 men who looked more like accountants than settlers. He asked questions, took notes, tried to buy her cabin. Naomi refused. He offered again, gold this time, then rights to some land, then partnership in a company. Naomi didn't answer, so Lennox went to the others. He offered them tools, supplies, even built a small mock-up of one of Naomi's heat pits in the middle of town square with hired hands. It collapsed by morning. Frozen mud, no vent seal, wrong rock depth. He left the next day, cursing under his breath and warning he'd be back with permits. No one cared, because what Naomi had built couldn't be bought. It wasn't for sale. It wasn't even hers anymore. It had become part of the valley, and that meant the valley had to protect it. So when a second group came, this time a pair of traveling writers hoping to publish Naomi's story for city folk, she refused to speak, wouldn't even open the door. She just pointed to a pair of shovels outside and said, "If you want to write, start here." They left the next morning, blistered and sore, but not before one of them looked back and said, "She's doing something no one thought possible," to which Vernon Black replied, "Only because no one thought to listen." By the end of the month, the freeze had lifted in name only. The air warmed by degrees, but the ground stayed dead. Nothing grew, nothing thawed, and the old hunger began to creep in, not from lack of heat now, but lack of food. They had shelter, they had warmth, but they were running out of time. Naomi knew it before anyone else. That's why she had been growing greens in clay pots. That's why she had been mapping which parts of the ground kept warmth longest. And that's why she began building the root tunnels. She didn't explain the idea. Not at first. She just dug long, low channels beneath the new cabins, lined with stone and filled with gravel, sealed against the air. At first, people thought she was preparing for spring thaw, some new drainage plan, but then she packed them with straw, hay, and carefully stored roots, carrots, potatoes, parsnips, and when she sealed the tunnels, she placed hot rocks in chambers around them, not enough to cook, but enough to keep the frost off. "You're growing underground," Clara said when she finally understood. "No," Naomi said. "I'm storing spring." By the time anyone else thought to copy her, 3 of her tunnels had already produced early shoots. It was enough to prove the idea, enough to start planning for real, and suddenly what Naomi had begun wasn't just survival or rescue, it was infrastructure. The valley had heat, now it had food, and as the wind began to shift and the first faint warmth of March touched the tops of the trees, the people of that broken, half-forgotten place began to believe in something bigger than endurance. They began to believe in preparation, in planning, in Naomi. And as for Naomi, she didn't rest, because the melt was coming, and melt brought flood, and she'd already begun digging channels for that too. The melt came with a roar, not a whisper. The sky didn't ease open into blue or spread slow warmth across the land like a gentle sigh. No, it cracked, hard, sudden. A week of snow fell in 3 hours, then vanished in 2. Ice sheets split like glass underfoot, and streams that had been nothing more than frozen ridgelines turned to wild torrents overnight. The ground, too long sealed in silence, began to groan beneath its own weight, and with it came panic. The cabins they'd dug so carefully into the earth, into banks, beneath the frost, beside ridges, began to flood, not with clean water but with the dark, heavy slush of rotted melt and choking runoff. Pits that had once held warm stones now gurgled. Heat tunnels hissed with steam and spoiled root. The ones who'd copied Naomi half-right were the first to lose everything. Their floors turned to bog, their clay cracked. Walls buckled where they hadn't been reinforced properly. Straw soaked through. Muck ate their stored grain. Panic returned like it had never left, sharp and loud and accusing. But Naomi had already been working 2 steps ahead. The children were the ones who ran the first warnings. Small boots pounding hardpack, shouting through the valley. "The ground's rising! Drain it," she said. "Naomi says dig the side vents. Now!" Some listened, others shouted back. "What vents? What do you mean flood?" She said we were done with winter, but winter wasn't done with them. It had one last trick. Naomi hadn't wasted the slight thaw. She'd used it to carve angled trenches beside the shelters, leading downhill, some just 6 inches wide, some a foot deep, all sloped with maddening precision. Folks had seen them, even stepped over them, not understanding. Now they understood. Those narrow ditches pulled meltwater away from the shelter walls. They ran like miniature rivers, lined with stone and packed with straw on their outer lips to catch debris. She'd even used broken glass shards in some, a barrier to keep burrowing rats and early pests from reaching the food tunnels. The few who dug those same trenches with her now watched as their shelters remained dry. The ones who hadn't scrambled. Vernon Black and Clara Reeve worked like people possessed. Vernon had dug too shallow. Clara hadn't sealed her lower pit vent. Both cabins took on water. Not enough to drown, but enough to spoil. So they tore out the soaked clay and started again. Right there in the mud, mid-storm, mid-flood, with wind cutting through their sleeves and steam burning their eyes. And Naomi moved among them like the storm herself. Quiet, fast, unshakable. She didn't shout, she didn't pause, she pointed. "There, cut lower. Open that vent. Sand, not straw. Pack it tight. She knelt beside children, dragging stones twice their size, took their fingers and taught them how to test slope by watching which way a bead of water ran off a stick, showed them how to feel for soft ground beneath hard pack, how to spot frost pockets about to give way. Feel the whisper under your feet, she told a boy no older than 6. That's where the melt's coming. That's where you dig first. And he did, and it worked. By the second week of melt, most of the valley had seen some damage. A few lost stores. One roof fell in where the beams had rotted unseen. A woman named May broke her wrist when a clay wall collapsed mid-shovel. But no one died. No child was buried. No shelter was lost whole, because they knew what to look for, because they were ready, because Naomi had taught them. But still there were questions. Why had she known? How had she predicted it all? So precisely, so fully, and so far ahead. Some still whispered, even now, not with suspicion, but with that same reverent fear they used to save for the preacher's voice or lightning strikes. Naomi had become more than a woman to some of them. She had become something like a warning made flesh. The truth, though, was simpler. Naomi's first year alone after her husband's death had been hell. No one had seen it because she hadn't shown them. But in the silence of that winter, when her youngest cried himself to sleep and her middle child burned with fever and she hadn't had enough dry wood to last past February, Naomi had watched her first shelter collapse under melt. She'd dug too deep, too narrow. She'd trusted the slope behind the cabin. When the thaw came, it poured through the back wall like a burst dam. She had stood in icy muck holding a baby and a rusted bucket, scooping night after night until the water slowed and the cold went dry again. She'd learned, she'd studied, she'd rebuilt, stone by stone, inch by inch, pit by pit. She remembered how her husband had shown her the tricks of heat traps, back when they'd hunted traplines together in the woods outside Cali Ridge. She remembered the old sayings from her grandmother about earth heat and low-vent warmth. She remembered reading scraps of torn pages in old trading posts about root cellars and thermal capture zones in stone-lined dugouts out east. And she'd paid attention. No one else had. Not like that. Not like someone whose life depended on it. The melt ended in a hush, not a grand sunrise or a moment of triumph, just a slow return of color to the earth. Trees shed their frost. Birds began to flit again, quiet and cautious. The ground grew spongy. Water pooled in low places and stayed. But the shelters held. The stores stayed dry. And food, though tight, was manageable. Spring wasn't here, not truly, but it was close enough for hope, and with it came something Naomi had never expected. Visitors, not the surveyors or buyers or officials with papers and questions, but families, from over the ridge, from further valleys. Folks who'd heard rumors, heard about the shelters that had stayed warm with no fire, heard about the widow who didn't let her neighbors freeze, heard about the winter that had come and gone and left a place better than it found it. They came walking, on foot, leading oxen, pulling children, carrying what they could. One man from the west said his whole settlement had lost everything. He'd heard from a trapper about the Harrow Way. Didn't believe it, he said, but I came anyway. Figured I'd find firewood stacked to heaven or some miracle machine. Instead, he found a woman packing dirt into clay molds with a girl on her hip and a boy stacking stones beside her. Guess I did find a miracle, he whispered. Naomi didn't smile. She handed him a shovel. The valley grew, not quickly, not comfortably, but steadily. The new families were given tasks. They dug, they listened, they learned. And the people who had once mocked Naomi now passed on her instructions like gospel. They showed newcomers how to bend warmth into the ground like a trapped breath, how to store food, not in fear, but in rhythm with the thaw, how to build shelters that grew stronger as the world crumbled around them. Naomi watched all this and said little. She let others speak now. Vernon, Clara, Booth, even quiet Jed. They taught, not because they wanted to impress her, but because they knew what it meant now, to survive by learning, not just reacting, not just enduring, but preparing. And in that they found dignity again, a kind they'd forgotten, a kind no storm could wash away. But just as the land began to soften, another challenge rose, one that Naomi could not dig through, nor silence, nor outpace. Her own body. It had been failing quietly for weeks, maybe longer. She'd hidden the cough, the limp, the way her hands shook when she thought no one was looking. The long nights where she sat with a wet cloth pressed to her temple, face pale under the lamplight. No one dared ask. Until one night, Vernon found her collapsed near the root tunnels. She was conscious, barely. He carried her back to the cabin. Clara was already there, boiling water and whispering like prayers could hold the walls together. Naomi didn't speak much, but she watched. She watched as Vernon packed warm stones beneath her bed. She watched as Clara sealed the windows with her patchwork cloth. She watched as her oldest child, barely 9, took her youngest onto her lap and fed her slowly, carefully, like she'd seen Naomi do 100 times before. She watched the work continue without her, and she smiled. Not a full smile, just a trace, but it was real. She didn't die, not that night, not the next, but she grew weaker. She stopped walking far. She let others carry the instructions. And as spring crept in, not with glory, but with mud and melt and bruised light, Naomi became something else to them. Not just the teacher, not just the survivor. She became the reason, the proof that one act of observation, one decision to notice what others overlooked, could change everything. Because the truth was, she hadn't discovered fire, she hadn't invented a machine, she hadn't cured disease or stopped the wind. She had simply paid attention to what the rest had ignored. The ground, the air, the quiet places where heat lived, hidden and patient. She'd seen what others didn't want to see. That warmth wasn't a flame, it was a choice. By the time true spring reached the valley, green pushing up from the thawed ground, creeks running clear, sun finally warming faces without knives in the wind, Naomi could no longer rise without help. Her strength had faded like a slow dusk, leaving behind only the memory of fire. But the valley moved like she had taught it. They didn't wait for disaster anymore. They prepared. Trenches were dug before rains fell. Root tunnels were cleared and rebuilt. Shelters were reshaped with better sloping, stronger walls, tighter seals. Children who once feared the cold now pointed out flaws in their parents' heat pits with stubborn pride. Naomi's cabin became something like a council house. Folks came not just to ask for help, but to report what they'd done. "We've reinforced the walls like you said. We're drying clay early this year. We tried the double vent. You were right." Naomi would listen, nod. Sometimes she'd whisper a correction, but mostly she just looked out the window where the snow had once laid deep and silent, and now bloomed with green. She didn't speak much near the end, but one day when Clara sat beside her, holding her hand, Naomi said softly, "They called it simple. That's how I knew it mattered." And then she closed her eyes. She didn't die that day, but when she passed not long after, there was no funeral in the old church, no preacher's sermon. The entire valley stood in silence outside her cabin as the sun rose, then walked together to finish the last root tunnel she had marked in the clay before she fell ill. They called it the Harrow Tunnel. And every winter since, when the frost comes early and the winds rise fast, the valley stays warm, because one widow had noticed what every settler overlooked.